Jax's revenge domain.
30 seconds. That's all it took for a $300 million system launch meeting to turn into the biggest corporate meltdown I've ever witnessed. The meeting that Tuesday morning was supposed to celebrate the rollout of Argus, our logistics automation network that I'd spent the last 15 years building from the ground up. Instead, it ended with the CEO's wife walking into that conference room and deciding the guy who architected the whole damn thing wasn't needed anymore. My name is Wade Hutchinson. I'm 47 years old, and for the past 20 years I've been the backbone keeping this company's network running. Started right out of community college as a field tech crawling through server rooms and pulling cable. Worked my way up to principal network engineer the hard way. No MBA, no fancy connections, just solid work and systems that never went down. Let me tell you how this all started. I'd been at work since 5:30 that morning, same as every day for the past 2 decades. Copy in hand, walking through the server room, checking overnight logs. You get to know the sound of a healthy network after 20 years, the hum of cooling fans, the soft clicks of switch activity, the almost musical rhythm of data moving through fiber optic cables. That morning, everything sounded perfect. The warehouse floor below was already humming with the morning shift. 800 workers moving freight, loading trucks, keeping America's supply chain running. Every piece of equipment down there, every conveyor belt, every loading dock door, every handheld scanner connected to the network infrastructure I'd built node by node, switch by switch, router by router. People always asked me why I came in so early. Truth is, I liked the quiet. Liked being there when the system woke up, making sure everything was running smooth before the suits showed up with their meetings and their PowerPoints. I'd built this network with my own hands and I treated it like what it was. The nervous system of a company that employed nearly 1,000 people. The conference room that morning overlooked the main warehouse floor through floor-to-ceiling windows. I could see forklift operators moving pallets, truck drivers checking their routing tablets, supervisors coordinating the morning dispatch. All of it running on systems I'd designed. Protocols I'd written, redundancies I'd built in case something went wrong. Scott Palmer, our operations manager, was already there when I walked in, laptop open, trying to look like he understood the technical readouts. Scott had his MBA and talked a good game, but I'd bet money he couldn't troubleshoot a basic router configuration if his life depended on it. Still, he was a decent enough guy, just out of his depth when it came to the technical side. System status looks green across all sectors, Scott said, scrolling through the dashboard I'd spent 3 months designing. Network performance has been rock solid during the testing phase. Paul Garrett, our CEO, sat back in his chair looking relaxed. Paul was one of those executives who'd worked his way up through sales, knew the business side inside and out, but freely admitted he didn't understand the technology that kept it all running. Outstanding work, everyone. Wade, the uptime reports look incredible, I nodded, pulling up the detailed metrics on my tablet. We're sitting at 99.7% uptime for the past 18 months. All critical systems have triple redundancy built in. Authentication protocols are military-grade. Biometric verification required every 4 hours for security clearance. That authentication part was important, though nobody in that room really understood why yet. See, when you build a system from scratch like I had, when you spend 15 years thinking through every possible failure point, every potential security breach, every way things could go wrong, you get to make some decisions about how it operates. And I'd learned a long time ago that in corporate America, the guy who built the system better make damn sure he stays in control of it. Scott pulled up the network topology on the big screen, a beautiful sight if you understood what you were looking at. Hundreds of interconnected nodes, fiber optic backbones, redundant pathways, load balancing algorithms. With Argus fully deployed, we're looking at automated routing for 12 major distribution centers, real-time inventory tracking across 8 states, and predictive logistics that can reroute shipments based on weather, traffic, even fuel prices. I watched the data flowing across the screen, my life's work displayed in real time. Every packet of information, every routing decision, every backup protocol representing thousands of hours of planning, testing, debugging. Most people saw numbers and charts. I saw the digital nervous system of a company that kept families fed, kept the economy moving, kept America running. The warehouse floor below us was a symphony of coordinated activity. Conveyor belts carrying packages in perfect rhythm, loading dock doors opening and closing on automated schedules. Forklifts following optimized paths between storage areas, every piece of equipment talking to every other piece through the network I'd designed. Tommy Rodriguez, our union rep, had stopped by earlier that morning while I was running diagnostics. Wade, the guys wanted me to tell you this new system's making their jobs a lot easier. Routing's more efficient, less manual paperwork, better safety protocols. That meant something to me. I wasn't just building networks for corporate profits. Those 800 workers had families, mortgages, kids heading to college. When the system worked smoothly, they got their overtime hours, their productivity bonuses, their job security. When it didn't, people went home without pay. Then the conference room door opened and everything changed. The whole room went quiet. Brenda Garrett walked in wearing a $2,000 suit and the kind of smile that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. She's Paul's wife, no official position in the company, but everyone knew she had opinions about how things should run, strong opinions. Her eyes scanned the room slowly, taking inventory of who mattered and who didn't. When they settled on me, I knew this wasn't going to be a congratulations meeting. I'd seen that look before, the same expression she'd worn 6 months ago when she'd convinced Paul to hire her nephew as a systems consultant, despite the kid barely knowing how to reset a router. "Paul," she said, not taking her eyes off me, "we need to talk about operational efficiency." Paul shifted in his chair, and I could see him trying to figure out how to handle his wife showing up in the middle of a technical meeting. "Brenda, this is our system launch review." She ignored him completely and pulled out her phone, setting it on the table with a text thread already open. I could see Paul's name at the top of the conversation. "I've been reviewing our operational dependencies with some consultants I know, and frankly, this company has a serious problem." Scott leaned forward, probably thinking he was about to get promoted. "What kind of problem?" Brenda's smile got wider and I felt my gut tighten. "We're too dependent on legacy personnel. In today's market, we should be working with modern IT consultants, cloud-based solutions, agile methodologies." She looked directly at me, not old-school technicians who think they're irreplaceable. The room was dead silent except for the hum of the HVAC system and the distant sound of truck engines from the loading docks below. I could feel everyone looking at me, waiting to see how I'd respond. I kept my voice level and professional. "Ma'am, this system supports critical infrastructure for 800 employees and millions of dollars in daily operations. The architecture requires exactly my point." She cut me off. "No modern company should depend on one person to keep its systems running. What happens if you get hit by a bus? What happens when you retire? We need scalable, transferable solutions." I almost laughed at that. Scalable solutions. This woman probably thought the cloud was an actual cloud. But I'd learned over the years that arguing with executive spouses was a losing game, especially when they had their minds made up about something they didn't understand. "Well," I said, checking my watch, "I guess we're about to find out how transferable it really is." She frowned. "Excuse me?" I stood up slowly and unclipped my security badge from my shirt pocket. The plastic card made a small click when I placed it on the conference table next to her phone. "If the system's so easy to manage, you shouldn't have any problems, Wade," Paul said, and I could hear the warning in his voice. Let's not be hasty here. But Brenda was already pulling up another screen on her phone. "Paul asked me to handle this transition personally. Wade, your services are no longer needed on this project. Effective immediately." Betty Chen, our HR manager, cleared her throat nervously. She'd been with the company almost as long as I had, worked her way up from the warehouse floor to management. "Brenda, personnel terminations require proper documentation, legal review, executive authorization through the board. My husband runs this company." Brenda cut her off with the tone of someone who'd never had to worry about a paycheck in her life. "When Paul makes a decision, it gets implemented. Period." I looked at Paul, waiting to see if he'd back up his wife or his 20-year employee. The silence stretched long enough to give me my answer. Paul was staring at his hands, not meeting my eyes. After 2 decades of keeping his company running, he couldn't even look at me while his wife fired me. Tommy Rodriguez stood up from his seat near the back. "Hold on just a minute. Wade's not just some contractor you can dismiss. He's got seniority, union protection. Union protection doesn't apply to management positions," Brenda snapped, "and Mr. Hutchinson is being replaced with more efficient solutions." I picked up my jacket from the back of my chair and pulled it on slowly. Part of me wanted to tell them exactly what I thought about their efficient solutions. Part of me wanted to explain in great detail why firing the network architect on the day of a major system rollout was about the dumbest thing I'd ever seen in 20 years of corporate America. Instead, I just smiled and said, "You might want to explain to the engineering team why the network's authentication authority just walked out the door." Scott looked confused. "What does that mean exactly?" "System requires biometric authentication from the primary architect every 4 hours for security compliance," I explained. "Last successful scan was at 6 a.m. this morning." I checked my watch again. It was 9:45 a.m. Next authentication window opens at 10 a.m. and closes at 10:15. After that, I shrugged. "Well, you'll figure it out." Brenda waved her hand dismissively. "We'll have IT handle whatever technical issues come up." I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. Good luck with that. Paul finally looked up. "Wade, maybe we should discuss this more carefully." "Nothing to discuss," I said. "Your wife made the call. I'm just the guy who built the system." I headed for the door. "Oh, and Paul?" You might want to check with legal about Department of Transportation regulations when your network goes down and strands 200 trucks across 8 states with perishable cargo. I could hear chairs shifting behind me as that particular detail sank in. DOT violations weren't just fines, they could shut down our transportation licenses, cost us every major shipping contract we had. The door closed behind me with a quiet click. I made it to my truck in the parking lot before my phone started ringing. Roy, my brother, and the only lawyer in the family who actually returned my calls. "Let me guess," he said when I answered. "They finally pushed you out. CEO's wife just fired me in front of the whole leadership team." Roy whistled low. "Wade, if they start bad-mouthing you in the industry, that could follow you for years. Logistics tech is a small world. I started my truck and pulled out of the parking lot I'd been driving into for 20 years. In my rearview mirror, I could see the main building, all glass and steel, with the company logo reflecting the morning sun. Maybe. But right about now, that network is starting to realize its primary administrator isn't coming back." "What do you mean?" "Authentication lockout kicks in at 10:15, I said. After that, the system goes into security protection mode. No overrides, no manual controls, no emergency bypasses." There was a pause. "You built a kill switch into your own network. I built a protection protocol. Big difference." By 10:30 a.m., the first alerts started showing up on the operations dashboard. I wasn't there to see it, but Betty told me later the whole thing unfolded exactly like I knew it would. The network began with small warnings. Yellow notifications on secondary systems, authentication timeouts on backup servers. Nothing that would panic anyone who didn't understand how the architecture really worked. Scott was standing at the main console trying to look competent while Betty and a couple of junior technicians watched the screens. Getting some minor connection issues, he said, typing commands he'd probably memorized from a manual somewhere. Probably just a temporary sync delay. Brenda had positioned herself near the back of the operations center, arms crossed, watching everything with the confidence of someone who'd never had to fix anything in her life. She'd probably convinced herself that firing me was already paying dividends. The alerts kept coming. Yellow warnings started shifting to orange. Authentication failures on primary routing systems, network traffic beginning to slow down across multiple nodes. Betty called from her workstation, and I could hear the worry creeping into her voice. "Chicago Distribution Center is reporting significant system lag." "How much lag?" Scott asked, and for the first time his confidence was starting to crack, enough that the automated sorting is backing up. Conveyor belts are starting to queue, and the drivers are asking for manual routing instructions. On the warehouse floor below, you could see it happening in real time. The smooth rhythm of the morning shift was starting to stutter. Packages backing up at sorting stations. Forklift operators standing around waiting for routing instructions that weren't coming. Truck drivers checking their tablets and finding empty screens where their delivery routes should have been. Scott tried to access the primary network controls using his administrative account. Access denied. He switched to a different terminal, tried his supervisor credentials, denied again. I'd set up the authentication hierarchy years ago, and when push came to shove, only the primary architect could authorize major system changes. "This doesn't make sense," Scott said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I have full administrative rights." Betty pointed at the authentication log scrolling across her screen. Primary architect credentials expired at 10:15. Systems locked all override functions pending security verification. That's when the phone started ringing, all of them all at once. Betty grabbed the first line. "Atlas Freight says their automated routing just stopped updating. They've got 30 trucks sitting in our parking lot with no delivery instructions." She hung up and immediately answered another ringing phone. Transcontinental is reporting the same thing. Scott stared at the network topology display, watching more and more nodes shift from green to yellow to orange. There has to be a manual override. Some kind of emergency protocol. There is, Betty said quietly. Wade programmed in emergency procedures. But they require biometric confirmation from the primary architect. Brenda pushed forward to the main console. "This is ridiculous. It's just software. Push some buttons and fix it." But software wasn't just software when you were talking about a system that controlled the movement of millions of dollars in freight across 8 states. Software became infrastructure. Infrastructure became the foundation of people's livelihoods. Tommy Rodriguez came storming into the operations center, still wearing his hard hat from the warehouse floor. "What the hell is going on up here? I've got 400 guys standing around with nothing to do because the systems are down." Scott looked like he was about to throw up. "We're working on it." "Work faster," Tommy said. "These guys are hourly workers. Every minute they're standing around is money out of their families' pockets. And it's Tuesday. Some of these guys were counting on overtime this week to pay their rent." That hit home for me when I heard about it later. These weren't abstract numbers on a financial report. These were real people with real bills, real mortgages, real kids who needed school clothes and groceries. When corporate politics shut down the network, it was the working folks who paid the price. By 11 a.m., it wasn't just alerts anymore. It was a full-scale crisis. The warehouse floor had gone from controlled chaos to complete standstill. Conveyor belts were backing up with packages that couldn't be routed. Loading dock doors weren't responding to automated commands. Truck drivers were sitting in their cabs making frustrated phone calls to dispatchers who didn't have any answers. Charles Morrison, the CFO, came rushing into the operations center looking like he'd just gotten the worst phone call of his career. Charles was old school, worked his way up through accounting, understood that when operations stopped, money stopped flowing. "What's our exposure here?" he demanded. Betty pulled up the financial dashboard. "If the network stays down past noon, we're looking at $3 million per hour in stopped operations. Add DOT violations for delayed freight, union grievances for lost wages, and client penalties for missed delivery windows." Charles went pale. "This system supports how much annual revenue?" $300 million, Scott said quietly, "and the person who designed it is no longer with the company." Charles was quiet for a long moment, staring at the screens full of red alerts and error messages. Then he pulled out his phone and made a call that would change everything. "Mr. Morrison," he said, "we have a situation that requires immediate board attention." James Morrison, no relation to Charles, despite the same last name, was chairman of the board and the kind of man who'd built companies from the ground up. When Charles Morrison called the chairman with an emergency, it meant something serious was happening. "How serious?" James asked. "We just lost our entire logistics network because someone fired the architect." There was a long pause. Who authorized that termination? Charles looked around the room. Paul was nowhere to be seen, probably hiding in his office trying to figure out how to explain this to the board. Brenda was still standing near the console, but her confident smile was starting to fade as the reality of the situation sank in. "The CEO's wife?" Charles said finally. Another pause. "Longer this time? I'll be there in an hour. In the meantime, get me a full incident report and the contact information for whoever built that system." The black sedan arrived just after noon. It stopped in front of the company's glass headquarters while the operations floor upstairs was still fighting the system failure. The driver stepped out first and opened the rear door. James Morrison emerged slowly. He moved with the calm patience of someone who didn't just run companies, but whose decisions affected thousands of families. Inside the lobby, the security staff straightened immediately. "Mr. Morrison," he acknowledged them with a small nod and walked directly toward the elevators. By the time he reached the executive floor, the emergency meeting had already started. When the boardroom doors opened, several executives stood instinctively. People did that around James Morrison. He'd started 3 companies from scratch, survived 2 economic crashes, and had the kind of reputation that made grown men in expensive suits suddenly remember their manners. Charles Morrison, still no relation, despite sharing the last name, had financial exposure projections spread across multiple screens. Scott sat against the wall, silent and pale. At the head of the table sat Paul, looking like a man who just realized his career was circling the drain. James Morrison entered the room and took an empty seat at the far end of the table. No greeting, no small talk, just a quiet look around the room that made everyone want to confess their sins. Finally, he spoke. "Tell me exactly what happened." Charles answered first. "Critical system failure, network authentication lockout, 800 workers sent home without pay, multiple DOT violations for delayed freight, client contracts at risk." James listened without interrupting. Then he asked the question that made the room go dead quiet. "Who designed the system?" Charles cleared his throat. "Wade Hutchinson, 20-year employee, principal network engineer." James nodded slightly. "And where is Mr. Hutchinson now?" The silence stretched long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Finally, Paul said, "No longer with the company." "Why?" Paul looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. "Personnel decision made earlier today." James's expression didn't change, but somehow the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "Made by whom?" Another long silence. Paul's voice was barely a whisper when he finally answered. "My wife." James Morrison leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. When he spoke again, his voice remained calm, measured, and absolutely final. "Let me see if I understand this correctly. A person with no authority over operations fired the architect of a $300 million system on the day of its full deployment." No one answered because there wasn't really an answer to give. James continued. "Mr. Garrett, what are the potential losses if this continues through tomorrow?" Charles pulled up the financial projections. Conservatively, $50 million in direct costs, another $100 million in client penalties and contract violations, potential loss of transportation licenses if DOT decides to investigate. Just then, the boardroom door burst open. Brenda Garrett stormed in, still wearing her $2,000 suit and her entitled attitude. This is absolutely ridiculous. If a system fails because one employee leaves, that's a design problem, not a personnel problem. The room went so quiet, you could hear the ventilation system humming. James Morrison looked at her for a long moment the way you might look at a particularly interesting insect. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "you're not an employee of this company. Security will escort you from the premises immediately. You're not to return under any circumstances." 2 security guards appeared at the door as if by magic. James turned to Charles. "Call Wade Hutchinson. Tell him the board would like to discuss his immediate return." As Chief Technology Officer with full authority over all technical operations, they called me at 1:30 a.m. I was sitting in my garage, cleaning my tools, and wondering if I'd just made the biggest mistake of my career, when Charles Morrison's number showed up on my phone. "Mr. Hutchinson," he said, and I could hear the exhaustion in his voice. "The board would like to offer you a position. CTO with full authority over all technical operations and a seat on the board of directors. The network needs to be restored, and frankly, we need someone who understands what we're dealing with." I drove back to the building I'd left 16 hours earlier. The parking lot was full of cars, executives, managers, people who never worked past 5 p.m., suddenly there in the middle of the night, because their company was hemorrhaging money by the minute. Inside the operations center, nothing had changed. Red alerts covered every screen, error messages scrolling continuously. The warehouse floor below was empty and eerily quiet, like a factory town during the Depression. I sat down at my old terminal and placed my hand on the biometric scanner. After 16 hours of lockdown, the system recognized its architect. Immediately, everything responded. Authentication accepted. Network access restored. Primary systems coming back online. Throughout the building, servers hummed back to life. On the operations floor, screens shifted from red to amber to green like a Christmas tree lighting up. James Morrison stood quietly beside the console, watching the network stabilize. "Mr. Hutchinson," he said, "I believe this company owes you an apology and a promotion." The next morning, Tommy Rodriguez was back on the warehouse floor, coordinating with his crew as the conveyor belts hummed back to life. Truck drivers were getting their routing instructions. The 800 workers who'd gone home the day before were back on their regular shifts, paychecks secure. A company-wide announcement went out that afternoon. New CTO, new corporate governance policies, new rules about who gets to make personnel decisions affecting critical operations, and a new understanding that the people who build the systems deserve the same respect as the people who profit from them. I stood in the operations center that evening, watching the network flow charts on the big screens, data moving smoothly across fiber optic cables, truck routes updating across 8 states, warehouse systems synchronized and humming, everything working exactly as designed. For 20 years, I'd built this system quietly, fixing problems before anyone knew they existed, keeping the lights on while other people took the credit. Yesterday, someone decided the architect didn't matter. The network had a different opinion about that. Look, I'm telling you this story because I know a lot of you guys have been there. Maybe not with computer networks, but with something you built, something you knew inside and out, something that kept other people's families fed and their lights on. And maybe you've watched some suit or some CEO's spouse waltz in and decide your experience doesn't matter because they've got connections or credentials or just because they think they can. Here's what I learned that day. The people who actually build things, who actually make things work, who actually keep the wheels turning, we've got more power than we think. Not political power, not relationship power, but the power that comes from being the one who knows how things really work. And sometimes, just sometimes, that's enough to remind everyone else who's really essential and who's just along for the ride. This is a work of fiction. All characters and events are fictional, and any resemblance to real organizations or individuals is purely coincidental.